While preparing for another long J-horror month, I made a post asking for manga recommendations. And while there were plenty of good suggestions, there was one name that kept coming up over and over again. Maruo Suehiro is simultaneously one of the most famous and infamous modern-day Japanese artists. His style is extremely distinctive, and his subject matter is incredibly dark. So today we'll be doing a flyover view of his career, and we'll be learning just why he is the king of Ero Guro. To understand Maruo, we need to first understand Ero Guro. And to talk about that, we have to talk about Ero Guro Nonsense. This term is quite literally erotic grotesque nonsense. This was a sort of art movement in the early Showa era. It was focused on stories that mixed together erotic elements with the grotesque, and often quite gory imagery. And at the forefront of this was Edogawa Ranpo. Known for his mystery novels, Ranpo would also write particularly horrifying short stories with some erotic elements. The best example would be Caterpillar, a story about having sex with a quadruple amputee war veteran. This movement would die down as Japan entered into war with Russia, and eventually war with the entire world. Censorship would snuff out the genre for a period of time, but Ero Guro would come back with a vengeance in the pinku film genre of the late 60s to early 70s. This resurgence would extend into the world of manga, where one struggling young artist would find his niche. Maruo Suehiro would make a name for himself in the Ero Guro world, with his landmark manga, Shoujo Tsubaki, better known in the West as Mr. Arashi's Amazing Freak Show. If Maruo Suehiro is known for one work, it would be Shoujo Tsubaki. It is one of his most infamous manga, especially among Western readers. So what sparked so much attention and outrage that lasts to this very day? Well, let's dive into it. Shoujo Tsubaki has its origins as a short manga in Maruo's first short story collection. This story introduces our main character, Midori, who joins a freak show after becoming orphaned, and that is essentially the entire story, as it consists of maybe less than 10 pages. This, of course, would lead into Mr. Arashi's Amazing Freak Show, which isn't really a sequel so much as it is the main story just fleshed out. The plot is basically built around seeing our main character Midori suffer through life in an almost sadistic way. Midori is constantly abused by her freak show companions until she meets Masamitsu, a circus performer with eerie supernatural powers. Masamitsu immediately becomes infatuated with Midori, and he uses his powers to protect her from the rest of the performers. However, it becomes clear that he might be a little too protective of her. And really, this is almost describing the plot too coherently. It frequently gets sidetracked with surreal imagery, and seems to meander from event to event. With that being said, Shoujo Tsubaki is an experience first and a narrative second. Its disturbing imagery and graphic content still gets under the skin of readers today. In many ways, it is the go-to Ero Guro manga. It has some of the most gruesome scenes put to page, but visually everything is drawn cleanly and with precision. This mixture of grotesque scenes romanticized in a beautiful way is the heart of the Ero Guro movement. But is there more to Shoujo Tsubaki than Ero Guro? Not really. The aimless nature of the narrative and the abrupt conclusion really don't add up to any sort of overarching theme or point. Shoujo Tsubaki was inspired by kamishibai plays in the early Showa era, an era that Maruo shows a very particular fondness for. So maybe this pointless meandering narrative is a holdover from that older style of storytelling? Or maybe I'm just losing something in the cultural context here. How much this bothers you will depend on the person, but I would be lying if I said that it didn't bother me at least a little. To me, Shoujo Tsubaki is much more interesting in the context of its anime adaptation, known internationally as Midori. Midori is a one-to-one recreation of Shoujo Tsubaki, to a point where it's debatable if you could even call this an anime. The adaptation was created largely thanks to one man, Hiroshi Harada, who funded and maintained this project for 5 years, almost completely by himself.
どこの会社もやっぱりお金を出すような内容ではないので、制作費を全部自分で調達しなくちゃいけなかったんですね。で、アニメーションの制作費っていうのは人件費が主ですから、制作費がないということは外にスタッフに頼めないということで、50分ぐらいほとんど自分一人で作画、アニメーションの作画をしたり、背景を描いたり色を塗ったりしてたので、それで5年かかりましたね。
The film is uncompromisingly faithful to its source material. No edges are softened, no scenes are cut. I would almost say if you watch the film, then you basically experience the manga itself. And that reverence for the source material seems to be what got this anime made in the first place.
この少女椿は僕の前に、某日本の有名な特撮の会社とか、某有名なテレビ局とかビデオ会社の人が企画を考えてたんですけど、全部こう流れたらしいんですね。ですので私がそのオファーをした時も丸尾さんは実はまた流れるだろうと思って本気にしてらっしゃらなかったそうなんですね。それでなかなか連絡が来なかったんですけど、私が手紙で何度も熱心に、アニメ化したいんですということを続けていったら、それが通じて2人会いまして、その後はかなり親切にどういう資料を使ったとか。
Still, this adherence to the manga was a double-edged sword. While it was the reason that Maruo gave the go-ahead, no major company would release the film without cuts.
日本でいうところのタブーとされる、表現してはいけないものが原作にはかなり詰め込まれていますので、そのほとんどが引っかかるというような感じです。ですから一番最初これを作って上映する時は自主上映というスタイルをとって、必ず制作者が上映する劇場の現場に立ち会うということで、トラブルがあったら観客と直接対応するというスタイルをとってたんですね。ただビデオにしたりとかして日本で流通してしまうと一人歩きしてしまうので、日本ではそういう商品にして売り出すことはしてないし、上映もしてない。
Still, Midori would somehow find a release in 1992, with a censored version in 1994. In English, we have it completely uncensored in a glorious VHS to DVD quality rip. You know, that 480p transfer of a transfer quality just makes you feel dirty on the inside, so it's probably the most appropriate way to watch this movie. But a likely beautiful Blu-ray version might be on the horizon after the original 16mm print was discovered in 2013. All in all, Shoujo Tsubaki is a vertical slice of the Ero Guro movement. It draws inspiration from early Showa's Ero Guro Nonsense, and would in turn inspire a whole new style of its own. While pre-war Showa is a time period that Maruo keeps coming back to, he also takes inspiration from sources globally. In his early work, Maruo frequently drew scenes and characters from German expressionist films, like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, or Nosferatu. While Caligari was no doubt an influence on Maruo's visual style, Nosferatu no doubt sparked interest in the subject of Gothic fiction. A lot of Maruo's stories have a Gothic feeling to them. Whether this is from direct inspiration or simply influenced by proxy, his work tends to have some of these classical horror elements. And of course, there is no horror archetype more iconic than that of the vampire. In The Laughing Vampire, Maruo's Gothic themes are placed front and center. The story is about Mori, a young man just turned vampire, and how he adjusts to his new life under the careful guidance of his senior vampire, a woman with the appearance of the Oni Baba. Running parallel to the main story is a plotline centered around Luna, in which Maruo continues his established trend of making cute girls suffer. The first volume is a very focused vampire story. It's told in a less surreal, but no less macabre style than Maruo's earlier works. It has the hallmarks of a classical vampire story. Mori struggles learning the ropes as a fresh new vampire, all while his mentor seems to steer him further and further into depravity. But in a strange way, this story reminded me of a manga that Maruo did just before The Laughing Vampire, called Weird Storm Boy. This was also focused around a young boy protagonist with supernatural powers, but it plays out much closer to a shonen action manga than his normal Ero Guro flair. It's pretty interesting on its own right, so you should check it out. Similarly to Weird Storm Boy, Mori is also around the same age, has to balance school life around his vampirism, and eventually gets into some superhero-esque fights in the latter volume. However, The Laughing Vampire is clearly aimed at a much more mature audience. While Mori is sharpening his teeth as a vampire, Luna goes through tragedy after tragedy as her life seems to get worse and worse. In many ways, the abuse and bullying that she faces is similar to Midori, albeit with a seemingly better outcome in the end. However, this is only true of the first volume. If Volume 1 was a movie, it would be an extremely solid vampire flick. Volume 2 feels less like a continuation and more like a tacked-on sequel. New characters and antagonists are introduced, and it feels much less focused than the first volume. That's not to say it's bad. If you like the first volume, then you should absolutely read the second, if only for more of the art. The Laughing Vampire seems to have a pretty good sample platter of Maruo's interests and influences. And it's probably one of the better manga to start off with if you want to dip your toes into the world of Ero Guro. While Maruo would always dabble in other subjects and themes, his work always had the mark of Ero Guro on it. As a genre, style, or whatever you want to call it, Ero Guro plays off of two extremely based feelings. After all, the two things that people respond most to are sex and violence, and Ero Guro incorporates both in a way that's unsettling and captivating. But let's get straight to the point. Sex sells. And that's exactly what was selling when Ero Guro re-emerged with the pinku film genre of the late 60s. At the helm of this movement was Teruo Ishii, directing such titles as The Shogun's Joy of Torture and Orgies of Edo. But even though the movement was going through a fresh revival, there were still clear connections to its roots. And nowhere was the connection more clearer than in Ishii's horrors of malformed men. This film was actually an adaptation of several Ranpo stories all at once, but the one that it borrows the most heavily from was The Strange Tale of Panorama Island. This adaptation plays up the sexualization, and is pretty batshit crazy in a lot of other ways, but we'll have to dive into this film another time. While Ranpo's shadow loomed over the 70s revival of Ero Guro, nearly 40 years later, Maruo would pay tribute to his own Ero Guro roots, and adapt Panorama Island into a manga. Originally, I was going to talk about Panorama Island a couple of years ago, but while reading it, I quickly realized that it wasn't exactly what I wanted for a general horror manga video. However, as a Maruo Suehiro manga, Panorama Island is more than a good fit for this video. The plot of Panorama Island follows Hitomi, a struggling author who happens to also be the spitting image of a wealthy and recently deceased businessman. Hitomi quickly assumes the man's identity, under the ruse that he had risen from the dead, and soon he begins construction on his ultimate paradise, Panorama Island. The plot is built entirely around an underlying tension surrounding the main character. It's less of a horror story and more of a thriller, where you keep reading to find out how everything is going to fall apart for Hitomi. It also has an element of wish fulfillment to it. Our main character goes from being an underpaid writer to an exorbitantly wealthy industrialist. And that's all thanks to quick thinking and deception. There's a part of every reader that will see this and say, what if I was able to weasel my way into an obscene fortune? And that's mostly what makes the latter half of this book so fun. When Panorama Island is finally constructed, the art does everything it can do to convey a sense of wonderment and thrill from the entire island. But of course, no hedonistic paradise is complete without orgies and the occasional murder. The horror and mystery elements are there in the story, but they're not big features of it. In fact, the book is mostly devoid of Maruo's usual Guro elements. Instead, it plays up the eroticism much more, meaning that if you're squeamish about blood and guts, Panorama Island might be more your speed. Despite not having the blood quota that Maruo is known for, there are plenty of aspects to Panorama Island that naturally fit his interests. The opening scene of the story takes place right as the Taisho era becomes the Showa era, which, as we already know, Maruo draws a wealth of inspiration from, especially in Shoujo Tsubaki. Naturally, Edogawa Ranpo himself was inspired by Edgar Allan Poe, and both inspired Maruo. Panorama Island is in the same vein as Poe's gothic mystery fiction, and of course Maruo had previously explored those gothic elements in The Laughing Vampire. And despite being low on gore, there's still plenty of macabre elements to Panorama Island, such as a whole scene at the beginning of the manga where Hitomi has to get rid of his doppelganger's corpse so that he can steal its identity. Maruo would of course continue this in his much more gruesome adaptation of Ranpo's Caterpillar in 2009. And I talked about this manga a while back, so I won't be talking about it too much here. But together, these stories are a great introduction to both Suehiro Maruo and Edogawa Ranpo. After making such a big name for himself in the Ero Guro scene, adapting Ranpo's stories into manga just seemed like the natural conclusion for Maruo. Instead of just emulating it, he was now faithfully recreating the era of Ero Guro Nonsense. Ero Guro may have gone in and out of fashion, but Maruo's popularity remains. His art has even reached outside manga into books, album covers, and even a feature film. In 2016, Shoujo Tsubaki was adapted once again into a live-action movie. While not as explicit as the anime, it still treats the original manga with a great deal of reverence. I am so respectful of Suehiro Maruo, and a big fan of his, so I thought that I wanted to visualize his work. I think gore can be very effective if it can be artistic. Maruo's work captures the unique swirl of the erotic and the grotesque in a way that few other artists are able to achieve. He's one of the few people that can draw an absolutely deplorable image that's also impossible to look away from. But I think Maruo himself says it best.
僕の好きなアーティストで森村康正さんというパフォーマーがいるんですけれども、あの人がその気持ちが悪いと感じるものはそれは美がたくさんある状態だっていうふうにおっしゃってて。